Howdy, folks. Thanks for checking into Mr. Ulrich's landofbiology.com. I am Mr. Ulrich, and these are dung beetles rolling a ball of poop. In this notescast, we're going to be talking about the ecological niche and using that as an introduction to the concept of habitat and the idea of adaptations as a function of evolution. Now, a lot of students, when they come to me, they'll tell me about the niche as the job that a particular organism has in an ecosystem, and then I'll get them describing niches as bakers or bank tellers or whatnot. And we need to be able to describe the niche a little bit more specifically in terms of ecology. And when we do, we're really talking about where an organism lives, where it gets its resources from, so its habitat, and how it goes about getting the resources that it needs, and of course the resources that it needs then. These dung beetles live in the desert, and they're active both during the day and during the night, but they're really active once big organisms poop, and they roll the balls of poop up in front of biology teachers. So really what we're talking about then when we're describing the niche is we're talking about the where, the when, and the what that an organism does in a particular environment. The concept of a niche as a job that an organism has in the ecosystem is rather broad, and so we can start breaking this up into kind of subcategories. So the fundamental niche then would be the entire range of biological and physical environmental characteristics that an organism has the adaptations can physically tolerate. Now, that includes the extremes, and so we don't normally find the organisms in those extreme environments, and so there's actually a realized niche, and this would be like the actual niche. So this is where we typically do find those organisms as a result of pressures from other organisms and other environmental constraints. The parts of the abiotic environment that will influence the area in which we're going to find an organism are going to include things like substrate, whether it's rocky or gravelly, or heck, the water floating on the air on the surface of a tree, the amount of moisture, the amount of sunlight that it can penetrate towards that region, given it a particular temperature. Osmotic issues are also important. Some organisms will withstand a wide range. Some will have a very, very, very close range of osmotic and pH requirements in order to be able to survive. Exposure to the environment includes issues like desiccation, drying out. Altitude can provide differences in wind exposure, as well as temperature extremes, and even lack of oxygen for that matter. And going down into the ocean also will have its kind of gradient of conditions, physical conditions that the organism is going to have to contend with. And being able to contend with these physical environments can put the organisms into some rather extreme environments, and that can pose things that can be helpful and other problems that have to be dealt with. We can use the law of tolerance to kind of describe this difference between the fundamental niche and the realized niche, and how for each factor there's going to be kind of a range, a gradient of availability that the organism is going to be adapted for, and so there's going to be kind of a range that they can tolerate, but really that's going to include those extremes, and there'll just be an optimum range that most of them will be found within. These optimum ranges of resource availability will determine the habitat that an organism is able to survive in. So the habitat then is the actual place that has all of the optimum range for that particular organism, for all of their resource requirements. Some organisms will be able to live in a habitat that is very sparse, that doesn't seem like lichens, that doesn't seem like it would be able to support very much life. And others will have a very, very tight range of resources that it has to have. Frogs, like this leopard frog, need to have standing fresh water available in order to be able to survive. An organism's habitat isn't always just one type of habitat. Some organisms are able to inhabit a wide range of habitats because they're a little more adaptable. They're able to use different resources in different habitats given resource availability. This kind of pushes them sometimes. They're able to utilize suboptimal habitats, places where other organisms might not be able to be, and this allows them to, though it's not the best, they have less competition, and so it's this cost-benefit analysis that they have to do. And we see this with plants growing in extreme environments. Down here you can see these spruce trees on the lower parts of the mountain are growing much taller. Then we start to get up above where we're getting to the tree line, and those trees are a lot more, they're shorter, they're dwarfed. Some organisms will have a wide range of habitats that they'll exploit. Other organisms will have a very narrow range of environmental preferences that they'll have where they really want to be. And it might even look like the same type of environment to us. But when we look at things like aquatic organisms, they'll have a wide range of substrates that they really like to live on, whether to lay eggs or to hide from predators or to hide from prey or to find their food in, all different gradations and gradients that they prefer. Knowing about these different preferences can really help with conservation efforts in different organisms so that we can maintain the proper habitats for the organisms to thrive in. In order for any particular habitat to be suitable for any organism, it has to be able to provide the resources that that organism needs, like, of course, food and water, but also a place where the organisms can breed. If they need nesting sites, then, of course, they need nesting sites, and they don't want to be food, and they need to be able to survive in the environment that they're in. And all of this responsibility isn't on the habitat. The organism also has to have the adaptations that will allow them to get at the resources that are in that particular habitat. Some of these adaptations are better than others. Some of them are going to work better at getting those resources than other adaptations will. Adaptations becomes one of the critical concepts for students to learn when it comes to evolution. Adaptations gets used, the word adaptation gets used kind of loosely, and a lot of students think that an adaptation is something that an organism figures out or learns in order to become better at a particular environment, and that's not the case when it comes to the evolutionary sense of adaptation. Adaptations for evolution have to be inherited, they have to be written in the genes, and having them or not having them in a population is the result of generation after generation after generation of that gene being useful or not. Now, it doesn't mean that adaptations aren't behavioral. They can be. The osprey here being active during the day is certainly behavioral compared to the spotted owl, which is, well, they're active during the day sometimes too, but they're often nocturnal. Now, physiological adaptations would be things like both of these birds are warm-blooded, and that keeps their metabolism really high, having their enzymes just the right spot. So they're able to have the energy needed to fly. Where the fish that the osprey is holding there, cold-blooded, it doesn't have to fly, doesn't have to have all of those energy requirements that the bird of prey does, so its metabolism can be pretty low. Now, there are also structural adaptations. These are the ones that we tend to think of when we think of adaptations. The owl here can fly at night, and it flies silently because the edge of the feather is what we call it ragged. It's kind of all ruffled. And that breaks up the air, and so when they fly, they're silent. And I've heard them at night, or not heard them at night, seen them at night and been like, whoa, because you can't hear them. When you compare that to the owl's feather is not as ragged. So when they fly, you can hear the air whistling through their feathers. The fish can't hear them. So it doesn't bother them at all. The mice can hear the flapping, and they'll run away. So the owl would be rather hungry. these adaptations allow an organism to exploit a habitat by being able to get access to a particular resource. And as different organisms start to inhabit the same niche, start to get the same resource, having different adaptations is going to allow them to kind of split the niche, to specialize, so that they're not getting the resource in the same way at the same time. There's something that will partition that resource so that both of the populations can get it in their own special way. So the idea is by doing that, they limit competition and competitive pressure. So given enough time, all populations will specialize to their own particular niche, and that will limit the amount of competition between the organisms. We see this in the African savanna when we start looking at browsing animals out there that are eating the thorn bush and all of the scrub that's out there in the African savanna. The acacia forest is thorny and kind of tough to get through. It's hot and dry, not the friendliest place to live, but there's lots of different organisms that live out there and are adapted for life in the acacia forest. The browsers that we can find out in the African savanna all eat plants in the same grassland, in the same savanna, the same acacia forest. But their populations aren't in direct competition with one another because they have different adaptations, different ways of getting the food that they eat. And because they exploit it in different ways, they don't have the same amount of competition. The giraffes, of course, are tall. They're 3.5 meters tall, or 3.3 meters, I guess, according to this. Meters tall, pretty big. All right. When we compare that with the gerenuk, these guys are about 3 feet tall, and they weigh about 40 pounds or so, 40, 50 pounds. So slight, they have a long neck, just not as long as the giraffes. Compare that with the impala. The impala is a little bit shorter, 2.5 feet, a little beefier. We compare that with the dik-dik. They're tiny. They're only like a foot tall. They weigh like 6, 7 pounds at the most. And so because of the different sizes and different adaptations that they have, they're exploiting the environment in different ways and are in less competition. Organisms have adaptations like biorhythms and different activity patterns and different ways of moving and different ways of defending their resources that they have available to them, as well as defending their lives from becoming food, different adaptations that will allow them to breed better, to feed better, and all these categories aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Some things that allow you to locomote better are going to allow you to breed better as well. The praying mantis provides us with another example of different types of adaptations. Praying mantises are flighted. They do have wings, and that's a structural adaptation of having wings, being able to fly. But they can sit very still for a very long period of time waiting for prey to come close enough, and that is a behavioral adaptation that they have. Physiologically, the female mantid produces like this goo that goes around the eggs and that protects the eggs that she lays. Not all characteristics are necessarily adaptive. What it means to be adaptive is that having the characteristic contributes to fitness. When we mean fitness, we don't mean how in shape an organism is. We really are talking evolutionarily. So we're thinking how well an organism is adapted for a particular environment. And when we're thinking of evolution, if you're adapted, then you're going to have babies, and those babies are going to have your adaptations, and they're able to survive long enough to have babies of their own. And so that's really the measure of fitness. Mothering and play behavior, as seen in cats, is adaptive. They learn how to interact with one another. They learn how to hunt. Now, some characteristics are not really helpful. Though the fur of this cat is froofy and looks nice, I guess, not a big cat fan myself, but it looks nice. It doesn't help the cat really survive, except that the cat is pretty, and then people will want to breed the cat. But when we're talking about a wild type organism, having that really long fur is not necessarily adaptive. It's not necessarily going to help the organism survive. We're going to stop there for now. I hope that helps you understand what a niche is beyond just the job that an organism has in its environment, how to describe a niche, as well as the idea of habitat, how broad a habitat or how narrow a habitat an organism would prefer, as well as how an organism gets its resources has everything to do with the habitat as it does with the structures that the organism has in order to survive in that environment. Well, if you have any other questions, please, please, please feel free to drop me an email, put a note in the comments section. Other than that, we'll see you in class.